We have a family cabin in the middle of nowhere on a small lake with 2 other cabins surrounded by both forested area and flatlands. About 2 miles away from the cabin and across the dirt road is a wildlife reserve. As kids, we walked through there all the time. We had the opposite of helicopter parents. After about 30 minutes walking straight into these woods, there was a collection of abandoned houses, an old settlement. We went exploring and found that the people who used to live there just up and left. In each house, still dishes on the tables, clothing in the closets, cars parked in the clearings, all the strappings for horses in the barns. In one house, the floor had caved in and there was about 40 pairs of women's shoes scattered around the hole in the middle. No bones though, animal or human, nothing. We decided to stay away from the second floors of the houses after we saw that. We figured they'd be structurally unsound. After we told my parents, my dad wanted to come and look too. In one of the houses, we found a bedroom, fully intact. The sheets were still on the beds, the pillow still had the indentation of a head on it, but everything was covered in a thick layer of dirt and the dust on the floors only had our footprints in it. At the foot of the bed was this stunning, enormous gray fur coat. There were a few moth holes chewed in it, and it was as dirty as everything else, but when we inspected it, we knew it was real fur. Likely wolf or silver fox. It was gorgeous. Dad decided he was going to bring it back and clean it up and see if he could have it remade for my mom. As we were leaving, I got a chill on the back of my neck. And about 60 yards from the house, turned around and saw an old woman glaring at us from the window of the second floor. She had her hair in a loose bun and was wearing a blue shawl on her shoulders over a cream-colored blouse. I immediately felt super guilty. I grabbed my dad, who was about 10 yards ahead of me, and told him we had better put the coat back, because the woman was still living there and we had probably scared her and she looked pissed. We turned back and I pointed to the window I saw her glaring at us from. No one was there. I said she must have gone downstairs, and as we approached the house, still carrying the stupid coat, one of the windows in another house suddenly slammed shut. I fucking ran as fast as I could into the woods. Dad, being dad, stayed behind and started yelling for the lady to come out, that he was sorry, etc. We went upstairs, and there was no one there. Dust on the floor, undisturbed. Then my dad smarted up and dropped the coat in a big hurry, and we beat it back to the road as fast as we could. About 5 years later, the government demolished the whole settlement. And that was that. I was once canoeing the boundary waters between Minnesota and Canada. These aren't your normal backyard ponds. The boundary waters are thousands of enormous lakes interconnected with each other. We had been canoeing and camping along the lakes for about a week at this point. We didn't really have an itinerary, just planned to boat and camp and fish, live off the land for 2 weeks. We had a GPS and a satellite phone to call a helicopter for pickup whenever we were done. Anyway, about a week in and we were set to canoe a few hours to the next lake. An hour or so in and we're in the middle of an extremely long and narrow lake. Unfortunately, a storm started to blow in and the waves on the lake swelled to 2+ feet. Too much for our dinky little canoes. We pull off to a random clearing on the shore and set up camp in a rush to avoid being totally thrashed by the rainstorm. We set up camp and hunkered down for the night. By the next morning it had cleared up. We started walking up the coast of the lake about 200 feet from our camp looking for a good fishing spot. What we actually found was another campsite. It was absolutely wrecked. Trash strewn everywhere, tent collapsed and torn, clothes on the ground. At first we were just disgusted, like what assholes did this and left their shit out to be bear food? The more we looked around, the weirder things got. For one, their garbage was still hoisted into a tree to keep it safe from bears, but the whole bag was ripped open, despite being 30 feet in the air. Second, literally everything except the canoes were still at the campsite. Clothes, packs, food, rope, pans, like a serious set of hiking equipment. Enough for 2 or 3 people. Half of it was trashed and torn open. Mostly the packs, tent, and clothes. The other half was totally untouched but thrown on the ground, like somebody noped the hell out of there in nothing but their long johns, ditching hundreds of dollars of gear in the process. We waited a couple hours and eventually called it back to our helicopter crew, but they hadn't been aware of anybody else or gotten any distress calls. We eventually just left everything and moved camp. Everybody was pretty upset by it, and a day or two later we ended the whole trip early because it seemed like nobody wanted to be out anymore. It was the weirdest thing I'd ever seen. First thought was bear attack, but there was food left uneaten, and I've seen bear attacks on camps before, but nothing like this. Bears rip open packs and go after food and are generally pretty easy to scare away. What still sticks with me is why all their clothes and packs were still there, with half being totally destroyed and half being untouched. I still don't get it. I've done a lot of other camping and hiking, rafting and biking, all around the country, and I've never had any other weird experiences like that. I work in the outdoor field and lead trips regularly. I once led a trip to the top of Mount Stringer in North Carolina. It's a tough climb to get to the top and about 6 miles from the nearest road. I was leading a group of 8 middle school kids and we had 1 co-instructor. We were camping out on the top of the mountain and it was a beautiful night with a full moon. The kids and the other co-instructor went to bed in their tents. I chose to spend the night in a hammock that night. I was really into a book I was reading, so I stayed up and read until about 10:30 p.m. I turned my headlamp off to settle in for the night. Everything around me was rather bright from the moon, and from the position I was in, I could see down the trail we had hiked to get to the top. I laid there enjoying the scenery and noticed something moving on the trail. Bears are common in the area, so I perked up. As it got closer, I could tell it was a person. We were in the middle of nowhere, and there was someone hiking up the trail with no headlamp or any gear. I was just frozen watching this person move closer to our camp. They arrived at the top of the mountain where we were and just stopped. I watched as what appeared to be a man surveyed our camp. I really could only see the outline of him. He stood there for what seemed like 30 minutes, but it may have been 10. He then turned, sat down under a tree facing our camp. He was sitting up in a way that I knew he wasn't trying to sleep. He just sat there, staring at our camp. I had no idea what to do. I decided to wait it out. I waited, just staring at the man while he stared at my camp. This went on until about 3:30 a.m. Then he stood up, took a moment to survey my camp a few minutes longer, then went back down the trail he came up on. I, to this day, have no idea what that was all about, but it freaked me out. I was paranoid that we were being followed for the rest of the trip. My friends and I found a 22-year-old girl, face down in the mud, both legs broken with compound fractures. She had no cell phone, no water, no food, and nothing to keep her warm. Her friend was dead. A little backstory. My friends and I were hiking in a pretty popular spot in our area. It's a 150-foot waterfall that takes about 45 minutes of uphill hiking to get to. We decided to go bouldering around the bottom of the waterfall. There are various little pools and boulders where the water runs off from the waterfall. The bouldering trail is not on the main trail, and not many hikers ever veer off the main trail. When we found her, obviously we called 911 and gave her any supplies we had. Eventually a helicopter showed up and they flew her to the nearest hospital. Turns out she was hiking with her friend the night before when they both fell off of the waterfall. Her friend must have gone to get help, but unfortunately died less than 100 yards from where we found the girl, so no one knew she was hurt or that she was even out here. It's a miracle she was still alive, and mind-blowing to think what she had gone through when we found her 20 hours later. Last year I was with a buddy of mine, and we were going to do the Hart Creek Scramble in Alberta. but due to some health conditions he has, it was going to be too strenuous to complete, and we figured we'd make it an easy day and just do a simple trail. Now, we're both climbers and have been to Hart Creek for rock climbing in the past and had a great time, so it wasn't a surprise to see the sporadic climbers on the mountainside as we went. Hart Creek is also pretty popular and easy for people who just want to go for a nice nature walk and maybe have a picnic. Anyway, so we walked in, enjoying the day watching climbers on our way by. We saw a couple even doing some multi-pitch climbing, which means basically leapfrogging up the route. We settled in for lunch about a half hour later and left a couple hours after that. On our way back, I remember seeing a climbing shoe in the creek and thinking, oh, someone must have lost this. I picked it up when my buddy got my attention and I looked further downstream. Both climbers, a young man, 29 or so I learned later, and his partner were both lying in the creek bed, rope and harnesses still attached, dead. It was very surreal. We had seen these people climbing not 2 hours before, making their calls, having a good time. The first reaction I had was that I remembered that there was a family right behind us, a husband and wife with a young daughter who were playing in the creek on the way down. We ran back and stopped them and explained as quietly as we could what was ahead, and before we knew it, looky-loos had come by. It turned out that the husband was an off-duty RCMP officer, so he took control of the situation. I learned later we weren't the first on scene and that the authorities had already been called. It was a very quiet ride back into town that day. My friend from college was in middle school or so when she went on some hiking trip through the woods with a club she was a part of. It had started to get dark, so the older group leaders decided to lead everybody back. However, it quickly became apparent that they didn't quite know where they were. It was getting darker and darker, and they still weren't able to figure out where they were. Eventually, they stumbled across a small cabin. Without many other options, the group leaders decide to ask whoever is in it if the group can stay the night. They approached the door and knocked, but there was no answer. They knocked a couple more times and still no response. They tried the handle and found that the cabin was unlocked. As they entered, they were pretty freaked out by what they saw. Along the wall were several pairs of shoes. Scattered along another wall were a few bed frames. But the most startling thing was that the walls were just covered in chicken scratch writing. Everybody was freaked out, but it was too dark at this point to risk wandering into the woods blindly again. The group hunkered down on the floor. They didn't really get much sleep that night, but when daylight broke, they got the hell out of there.